Lord, bless the intentions of my heart and the words of my mouth. Amen. Well, welcome back to the resurrection of the Son of God as we, during this Lenten season, are preparing for that great festival of Easter Sunday. Last week, for those of you that were here and those that weren't, we started looking at life after death in the ancient world. Those of you that were here, would anybody like to offer the one big takeaway that you came away with last Sunday? Is there anything that stood out or that surprised you or would sort of summarize that Sunday? Plato? Plato, of course, the great Greek philosopher, and he's had a huge influence on Western civilization. His belief, of course, that all of us have a body and a soul, and the soul is good and the body is bad. And at death, the soul is liberated from the body, and we can really start living then. And that philosophy permeated the ancient world from the time of Plato and then also, of course, into the Christian church and for the last 2,500 years. And I think for most people that is a pretty big takeaway. Anybody else? Any thoughts?
Well,
Laura?
Plato, there was little, if any, hope.
Yeah.
When you died, you're dead.
Yeah. Yes. In fact, the one question I had last week, somebody asked, so wasn't there some belief, though, in life after death, or there would not have been any discussion or thinking about it? And that's true, there was some, but the vast majority of people in the ancient world believed that once you died, that was it. And there was various clever ways to describe that in the literature and in the dramas and tragedies of the day, of the Greek theater. But mostly people just thought when you died, and that was it. And so I think the thing to take away from that belief, and I mentioned it last week, is that Christianity then, the Christian faith, is going to come as a big shock to the pagan world. This is not something that, again, if you were going to invent a religion, if you were going to conspire and create something new and attract people to it, resurrection is not something that you would be an ingredient to that recipe. So keep that in the back of your mind. Now, this week, session 2, we're going to take a look at the Old Testament, life in the Old Testament, and what I call the intertestamental period, meaning that time period between the end of the writing of the Old Testament and the time of the New Testament or the time of Jesus. Next week, then, we'll look at resurrection in Paul. We'll start getting into the New Testament and what does Paul and other New Testament writings say about the resurrection. And early Christianity, the writings of the fathers. There's a boatload of writings in the first couple of centuries. And there's a lot there about the resurrection. Session 4, then, in a couple weeks, we'll look at the resurrection in the Gospels, the 4 Gospel narratives. There's obviously some interesting stuff there, and there's some peculiarities that we'll need to address amongst the 4. And then Session 5, the meaning of the resurrection for us. We'll try to wrap it all up. What's our hope? What do we really believe, and what should we believe and hope for with the resurrection? Now, just like last week, my hopes and prayers for you. When you study the resurrection, it's not just a mental exercise that you do. Hopefully, this is a spiritual endeavor that's going to increase your faith. When you start looking at the resurrection, you know, this is a core foundational belief. And when you talk about gospel, you want to talk about good news. Good news. Resurrection, living forever. It's an awesome thought in our minds. My little walnut-sized mind can hardly wrap my head around that. I also want you, hopefully, to face your own mortality with confidence in the love of God. Okay, of course, death hangs over all of humanity like a cloud, and our faith has an answer to that, though. Our faith answers that, has a solution for that. I also want you to increase your knowledge and defense of the Christian faith. Okay, this isn't some wild, ridiculous belief. To the outside world and to the enemies of Christ, in the readings today, it is. It is a ridiculous thing. But you're going to see as we go through this, and especially later on in the next few sessions, there are some questions that atheists must answer about the resurrection. There are questions that stand up to scrutiny, issues that stand up to scrutiny, and it's when you know those things, if you come across somebody in your life that is not a Christian and scoffs at the resurrection, hopefully I'll put some tools in your tool belt to provide a defense and an answer to them, and at least get them to think. And then, of course, this ties in with the first one, increase your faith and know the power of Christ's resurrection. St. Paul talks about that power. There's a power there, a spiritual power that I want all of you to tap into. So let's get started. Life after death in the Old Testament and the intertestamental period. So let's just define our terms here. The Old Testament was written somewhere between the 15th and 3rd centuries BC, before Christ. Okay, now, scholars can debate back and forth a few hundred years and so on and so forth. That's not our intention here. What we're interested in looking at is what is actually said during this period about life after death and about resurrection. And then the intertestamental period, which is from the 3rd century BC more or less to the 1st century AD until the New Testament starts to be written. What was going on there? And so we'll try to take a look at both of those things briefly today. There's a lot out there about this topic. And again, I feel like a hockey team that's playing shorthanded, if you're a hockey fan or whatever. I'm not on the power play. I'm shorthanded when it comes to this topic. And so I'm going to share with you what I think are the salient points and things to think about. But I want to encourage all of you. This is a topic that, as a Christian, I think demands your attention. Because, again, it's going to build your faith. It's going to increase your faith. So let's take a look. Life after death in the Old Testament. Well, to start with, N.T. Wright, the scholar, I think he makes a good point here for us to think about as we start looking at the Old Testament. He says the main focus of the Old Testament authors was not upon the fate of humans after death, but the fate of Israel and her promised land. That's the focus of the Old Testament writers. As time goes on, though, and once we get to the Christian period, a lot of this Old Testament is going to be looked at and reinterpreted in the light of the life of Jesus Christ. But you will see that a lot of the focus of the Old Testament, it's not about individuals. It's about Israel. It's about the people of God and what's going to happen to them, what's going to happen to the promised land, the land promised, of course, by Yahweh to Abraham and his seed, his ancestors. So I want to start with just sort of taking you through the Old Testament and giving you sort of a taste of what's there. There's going to be, though, and you'll see this, sort of a development from Genesis and the early works, a development in thought about life after death. It's going to go from very much almost like Homer, meaning there is no life after death, to then in the later period, people are going to start thinking and saying and believing that no, there is something there. First of all, from Genesis, dust you are and to dust you shall return. A very well-used, both in and out of the church, statement. We are all dust and to dust you shall return, from Genesis 3:19. Now that would lead you, if you take a look at that passage and just literally look at it, you would say, well, we're dust, and that's what we're going to end up as, a pile of dust. Not very faith-building. Psalm 6. Now the Psalms are loaded with references that the Christian church, looking back on the Psalms, said, wait a second, these are about life after death. These are about resurrection. But to an Old Testament Jew reading Psalm 6, there's not a lot of hope there. In death, there is no remembrance of you. In Sheol, meaning the land of the dead, who can give you praise? Ecclesiastes chapter 9. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. For in the realm of the dead where you are going, there is neither working, nor planning, nor knowledge, nor wisdom. There is nothing. Now, a casual reader of the Old Testament could be forgiven if, reading these passages, you would think that Israelite belief was similar to Homer, that there is no life after death, that these words, when you look at them, could have come from the mouth of Achilles in the Iliad or the Odyssey. But as time goes on, there's what I call exceptions or glimmers of hope. Glimmers of hope. How many like hope? Absolutely. Glimmers of, even a glimmer of it. I don't need a lot of hope. Just give me a glimmer of it. So now this starts to develop, and in Psalm 49, now the underlines and the highlighting are mine. This is Psalm 49. People, despite their wealth, do not endure. They are like beasts that perish. This is the fate of those who trust in themselves and of their followers who approve their sayings. They are like sheep and are destined to die. Death will be their shepherd. But the upright will prevail over them in the morning. Their forms will decay in the grave, far from their princely mansions. But here it is, the glimmer of hope. But God will redeem me from the realm of the dead. He will surely take me to himself. Psalm 49. So there you see the beginning. Somebody, the writer of Psalm 49, this thought is there. It's in their spirit. And they were inspired to write that verse 15 there. But God will redeem me from the realm of the dead, and he will surely take me to himself. Now this glimmer of hope that I'm going to read to you next, and you can follow along in your Bibles, this is a very unusual story. And when you read it, it's from 1 Samuel chapter 28, verses 3 through 25. I'll read it to you. If you want to open your Bibles and follow along, you can. This is a story about Saul, David, the prophet Samuel, who is dead, and a medium, meaning someone who is trying to consult and bring up the dead. 1 Samuel 28, 3 through 25. And I'll actually start with verse 1. In those days, the Philistines gathered their forces to fight against Israel. Achish said to David, "You must understand that you and your men will accompany me in the army." David said, "Then will you see for yourself what your servant can do?" Achish replied, "Very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life." Now, here's where the story picks up. Verse 3. Now Samuel, the great prophet Samuel, was dead, and all Israel had mourned for him and buried him in his own town of Ramah. Saul had expelled the mediums and the spiritists from the land. The Philistines assembled and came and set up camp at Shunem, while Saul gathered all the Israelites and set up camp at Gilboa. When Saul saw the Philistine army, he was afraid. Terror filled his heart. He inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him by dreams or Urim or prophets. Saul then said to his attendants, "Find me a woman who is a medium, so I may go and inquire of her." "There is one in Endor," they said. So Saul disguised himself, putting on other clothes, and at night he and 2 men went to the woman. "Consult a spirit for me," he said, "and bring up for me the one I name." But the woman said to him, "Surely you know what Saul has done. He has cut off mediums and spiritists from the land. Why have you set a trap for my life to bring about my death?" Saul swore to her by the Lord, "As surely as the Lord lives, you will not be punished for this." Then the woman asked, "Whom shall I bring up for you?" "Bring up Samuel," he said. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out at the top of her voice and said to Saul, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." The king said to her, "Don't be afraid. What do you see?" The woman said, "I see a spirit coming up out of the ground." "What does he look like?" he asked. "An old man wearing a robe is coming up," she said. Then Saul knew it was Samuel, and he bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" Saul said, "I am in great distress. The Philistines are fighting against me, and God has turned away from me. He no longer answers me, either by prophets or by dreams. So I have called on you to tell me what to do." Samuel said, "Why do you consult me, now that the Lord has turned away from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done what he predicted through me. The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hands and given it to one of your neighbors, to David, because you did not obey the Lord or carry out his fierce wrath against the Amalekites. The Lord has done this to you today. The Lord will hand over both Israel and you to the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will also hand over the army of Israel to the Philistines." Immediately Saul fell full length on the ground, filled with fear because of Samuel's words. His strength was gone, for he had eaten nothing all that day and night. When the woman came to Saul and saw that he was greatly shaken, she said, "Look, your maidservant has obeyed you. I took my life in my hands and did what you told me to do. Now please listen to your servant and let me give you some food, so that you may eat and have the strength to go on your way." He refused and said, "I will not eat." But his men joined the woman in urging him, and he listened to them. He got up from the ground and sat on the couch. The woman had a fattened calf at the house, which she butchered at once. She took some flour, kneaded it, and baked bread without yeast. Then she set it before Saul and his men, and they ate. That same night, they got up and left. Now, what does this tell us? Anything about life after death? I don't know what to make of this passage. It's very unusual. It's setting, it reads very literally like, an actual story. I don't know if it's metaphor or allegory, but it doesn't look like it. And here is Samuel from beyond the grave, the great prophet Samuel, who was called up by a medium and speaks to Saul. I don't know what to make of it, to be honest with you. It appears that Samuel obviously is alive after death. And he tells Saul, "Why have you called me up? Why have you called me up? Why do you consult me?" So that story from 1 Samuel is again for us to put in the back of our minds. It's food for thought. That here, Samuel, the great prophet of the Lord, was resting, was dead and resting, but was called up by a medium. Now, I don't want to get into the whole topic, of course, of mediums and the possibility of doing that. That's a whole nother topic. But I do want to take you to Isaiah. This is kind of a response to that. Isaiah chapter 8, 19, and 22. And again, you can look that up, or I'll just read it and follow along. This is a rebuttal of those mediums or spiritists, who try to call those from the grave. Isaiah 8, chapters 19 through 22. Here's what he says. When men tell you to consult mediums and spiritists who whisper and mutter, should not a people inquire of their God? Why consult the dead on behalf of the living? To the law and to the testimony. If they do not speak according to this word, they have no light of dawn. Distressed and hungry, they will roam through the land. When they are famished, they will become enraged, and looking upward, will curse their king and their God. Then they will look toward the earth and see only distress and darkness and fearful gloom, and they will be thrust into utter darkness. And so here Isaiah with a warning against doing what Saul had wanted, and Saul sought out a medium or a spiritist. Isaiah later prohibits that. Now, the idea there is necromancy might be possible, but it was forbidden and dangerous. That calling up of the dead or speaking with the dead. But for our purposes, what's interesting is 1 Samuel presents Samuel, the prophet, as living. He is alive. Even though he is in the grave, he is alive. Isaiah 26, as we continue on. And here again, you can see now the change of thinking. But your dead will live, Lord. Their bodies will rise. Like those who dwell in the dust, wake up and shout for joy. Your dew is like the dew of the morning. The earth will give birth to her dead. Pretty straightforward there, pretty clear. But your dead will live, Lord, says the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah 53. Now, this, of course, is the famous suffering servant passage from Isaiah. And the debate here, of course, is between Christians. Christians have taken Isaiah 53 and, of course, interpreted it in the light of the life of Jesus and his incarnation. Jewish people today would say Isaiah 53 is about the suffering servant Israel as a nation, as a group of people. But there's something here in verse 11 which the Christian church and the Christian faith will take as a fulfillment of this prophecy, the life of Jesus and his resurrection. Christianity will say, look at verse 11, this is a fulfillment. Jesus fulfills Isaiah 53. Jesus is the suffering servant. He is the embodiment of Israel. And so Isaiah 53, and again I highlighted what I thought was the key part here. Yet it was the Lord's will. This is Isaiah 53, and again about the suffering servant. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. And by his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Now, the Hebrew is open for debate there. It's sort of convoluted, but that verse 11, those Christians of the first century took this as, again, a fulfillment of the life, fulfillment of the Scripture by Jesus and his resurrection. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. Isaiah 53. Is this a reference again to the nation Israel or to the future Messiah? And this was written somewhere probably in the neighborhood of 500 or 600 years before the life of Jesus. So this was not one of those instances where modern scholars who are not Christians, they look at it and say, well, this had to be written after the fact. No, it was not. And it's well attested that this was centuries before the life of Jesus. Them bones, them dry bones. How many remember that song as a kid? Or even as an adult? Well, Ezekiel 37, and if you want to go to that quickly, Ezekiel 37, the valley of the dry bones, is that passage that is, it's definitely, when you look at it, it's definitely metaphor. It uses resurrection as a metaphor for the restoration of Israel. Israel's in exile, come back to the promised land, and Ezekiel uses resurrection language for that description of the restoration of Israel. Now, what's interesting here, though, is Yahweh is seen as creator. And that resurrection and taking those dry bones and giving them flesh and bringing them back, Yahweh, Ezekiel sort of makes it appear to be a very natural thing. Yahweh is the creator. Of course he can do this. And this is how he will resurrect or rebuild or recreate Israel, through his creative power. Here's Isaiah 37, quickly. The hand of the Lord was upon me, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord and set me in the middle of a valley. It was full of bones. He led me back and forth among them, and I saw a great many bones on the floor of the valley, bones that were very dry. He asked me, Son of man, can these bones live? I said, O sovereign Lord, you alone know. Then he said to me, Prophesy to these bones and say to them, Dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says to these bones. I will make breath enter you, and you will come to life. I will attach tendons to you and make flesh come upon you and cover you with skin. I will put breath in you, and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord. So I prophesied as I was commanded. And as I was prophesying, there was a noise, a rattling sound, and the bones came together, bone to bone. I looked, and tendons and flesh appeared on them, and skin covered them, but there was no breath in them. Then he said to me, Prophesy to the breath, prophesy, Son of man, and say to it, This is what the sovereign Lord says. Come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe into these slain, that they may live. So I prophesied as he commanded me, and breath entered them. They came to life and stood up on their feet, a vast army. And then he said to me, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. They say, Our bones are dried up, and our hope is gone. We are cut off. Therefore say to them, This is what the sovereign Lord says. O my people, I am going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. Then you, my people, will know that I am the Lord, when I open your graves and bring you up from them. I will put my spirit in you, and you will live, and I will settle you in your own land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken, and I have done it, declares the Lord. Yahweh as creator, as recreator, and resurrection as a manifestation of his great power. Ezekiel 37. And again, of course, the Christian church will look back at this and point to this. Not only is it metaphor, but there's some literal belief there. There's some hope in Ezekiel and a reference to the resurrection. Now, the Great Bridge, what I call the Great Bridge. This is from Daniel. Now, Daniel was probably one of the last books of the Old Testament to be written. And it was written during a time of great persecution for the Jewish nation. In Daniel chapter 12, Daniel, toward the end of his prophecy here, he says, "Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever." Now again, this is, there's no hidden meaning in these words. Daniel, all scholars across the spectrum agree that this is talking about literal resurrection. Daniel says, multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake. Some to everlasting life, and others to shame and everlasting contempt. And so here, Daniel is saying that everyone will be resurrected. Some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. Daniel is alluding to all of humanity being brought from the grave, those who sleep in the dust. Daniel, of course, is sort of a companion to the book of Revelation. When you study the book of Revelation, John the Revelator, he uses and refers to Daniel and is quite aware of it. And there are many, of course, allusions to resurrection and life after death in the book of Revelation. But Daniel here, during a time of great persecution, he wrote this, but obviously inspired by Almighty God, says, multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake. Now, is this figurative? Is it literal, or is it both? Some would say it's just a reference to rising from the persecution of Antiochus Epiphanes, who was the cruel tyrant that was persecuting Israel at the time. But it uses very clear language in referring to resurrection. And so the Christian church has always looked at this as, it's both. It's both again. It's sort of like Ezekiel, but the difference being that whereas Ezekiel was definitely metaphor or allegory, Daniel, when you read it in the context there, it's very specific and very clear. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake. And this is his vision, this is his prophecy that he writes down. Now, in 2 Maccabees chapter 7, 2 Maccabees, again, was kind of written more or less at the same time as Daniel, maybe a little later. But there's an interesting narrative in there about some young men who die because of persecution, and they're having a conversation with their mother. And again, I highlighted what I believe to be the salient parts for us. One of the young men says, when he was in his last gasp, he said thus, "Thou indeed, O most wicked man, destroys us out of this present life." So as he's dying, then he says, "But the King of the world will raise us up, who die for his laws, in the resurrection of eternal life." And then later, his mother says to them in verse 22, she says, "I know not how you were formed in my womb, for I neither gave you breath, nor soul, nor life, neither did I frame the limbs of every one of you. But the Creator of the world, that formed the nativity of man, and that found out the origin of all, he will restore to you again in his mercy both breath and life. as now you despise yourselves for the sake of his loss. The Creator again. Here is God as Creator, and he's going to restore, because of his mercy, restore both breath and life to those that die in this great persecution from 2nd Maccabees. So here, in this late period of the Old Testament, we have, again, very clear references to resurrection, a restoration by the Creator God, both breath and life in what he originally intended for us. Like Daniel, those who die horrible deaths out of loyalty to Israel's God and law will be resurrected. Now, resurrection thinking at the time of Jesus. Well, we're going to look at 4 or 5 different schools of thought here. First of all, there's the Hellenistic or Platonic school. The soul is good, the body is bad. A disembodied soul will live on. There were some who thought that. Of course, this is mainstream Greek philosophical thinking. And that was in operation at the time that Jesus was alive. There were many who thought like this. But there's also the old school pagans who are probably the majority. There is no resurrection. Maybe a shade-like existence, a ghostly-like existence, but definitely not as good as the present reality. When you died, it was a loss. It was not a win. It was a loss. That's the old school pagan thinking, and there was plenty of those people around. And again, they looked at Homer and those sorts of entertainment-type things as just that. And a pagan would say, oh yeah, that's an interesting little story or reference, but it has no basis in reality. It's entertainment. In the Jewish world, and we know this from the New Testament, at the time of Jesus, there were the Sadducees and the Pharisees, for sure. There's reference to those. In fact, Jesus had interaction with them. The Sadducees followed a strict interpretation of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. They denied the resurrection. They denied it. As conservatives, as conservative Jews, they said, no, there's no resurrection. They looked at, for example, Genesis and that verse we looked at, you are dust and to dust you will return. They looked at that as sort of a definitive word. And so the Sadducees said there was no resurrection. Now, when you read about their belief and why they believed like that, some scholars will say that this was also sort of a political belief, that the last thing you wanted to upset the social order of the day was the belief in a resurrection. Because then you get people, whipped up and acting differently, and that is not what a good conservative Jew wanted, at least the Sadducees. And we know, again, from the Old Testament, we know many, they deny the resurrection. And there are other sources outside of the New Testament that also attest to that. Then you had the Pharisees, of course. Now, the Pharisees were another sect within Judaism, and they were less conservative than the Sadducees, and they appealed to the commoner. And they believed in some type of resurrection from the dead. The Sadducees, or the Pharisees, believed that there was a hope. And of course, to the average everyday person living a miserable existence in Palestine at the time, any sort of hope at all, that was a good thing, right? And so the Pharisees, they had their following among the common people. Paul, it's believed, was a Pharisee. In fact, I think he describes himself as a Pharisee in his letters, in his writings. Then you have a group called the Essenes. And I bring this in. The Essenes were an unusual, very strict and detached sect of Judaism. They believed in a resurrection that was sort of spiritual. It was kind of hard to define. As I sort of looked at this, it was difficult to pinpoint. But they were around. Some people believe that they were the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found there in the Dead Sea, along the shores of the Dead Sea. They were very strict in their behavior. And in their beliefs. Now, I bring this up because there are some scholars who not a lot, but a few who think that, well, was Jesus himself affected by the Essenes, or did he know of them? And the answer is maybe. Maybe. It's interesting to speculate. The Essenes lived off by themselves in the Dead Sea, and they were separate. But that would answer. I always have people ask me, well, why is Jesus? Well, we don't know anything about his life. Why? There's a couple of paragraphs about his birth. There's a couple of sentences about when he was 12, and then boom, you fast forward to the last few years of his life. And so, where did he develop his beliefs and so on and so forth? Well, the Essenes were around at the time, and they were strict, but they believed in a resurrection, again, that was spiritual, hard to define. So here's the thinking at the time of Jesus. This is the world in which he lived. The Hellenistic or Platonic school, the pagans, and then you have the Sadducees and Pharisees, and Jesus battled with both of those groups. And then you had the Essenes, who also were in operation, but had a belief in resurrection. Now, what are our conclusions then? Life after death in the Old Testament. Well, there's a wide spectrum of belief when you look at the Old Testament regarding life after death. If you take from Genesis, you would think there's no hope. It sounds like Homer. But as you move forward and you get to some of the later writings, then this belief is there. It's there, and it's referenced, it's written about. So there's a wide spectrum of belief. But what I want you to understand is the word resurrection was not an all-inclusive word to describe life after death. Okay? When we talk about resurrection today in our world, we're talking about it from 2,000 years of Christian perspective. And so we think about life after death, we think, oh yeah, resurrection, right? This is not the way the word was used at the time of Jesus. Okay, the word resurrection, anastasis in the Greek, it's going to be, in fact, it was used to describe what doesn't happen to you for the most part. So my point of this is that resurrection then, when it comes on the scene here in the first century and with the life of Jesus, it's a cultural shock. It's a cultural shock. It's not something that, people were expecting. Within Judaism, there were differing beliefs, but a clear, gradual move toward resurrection as reward and judgment. Resurrection develops, and this is a key saying that we're going to think about here for the next few weeks, and I want you to think about in your own life. Resurrection develops to mean life after death. There is a life after death. You go to be with the Lord. Your body is in the ground. But then there is the life after that, the resurrected life. The life when God as creator restores, like to the valley of the dry bones, or in the words of Daniel, restores life to you in a resurrected, as we will see, a resurrected body. So that's how resurrection develops. Passages in the Old Testament increasingly are interpreted as resurrection references. And you can see this a lot in the New Testament in the first couple centuries. There's now going back to the Old Testament and saying, oh yeah, this verse here, yeah, that's speaking of Jesus' resurrection. That's what that's about. Now we understand. There's a lot of that takes place in the first and second centuries. And again, I've only hit on a few of those passages in this presentation. So I would encourage you to continue looking at this yourself. I hope this sort of clears up some things about the thinking in the Old Testament and at the time that Jesus lived. Do you have any questions or thoughts or comments about this? As you take this all in, this is quite different sort of thinking. When you think about resurrection and you think about the past and 4,000 years of faith history. Any offhand comments? Anything at all? If you have a question, there's cards and pencils if you don't want to ask me, and we're about ready to go here. But Anything at all, write it down. Next week when we come back, we're going to get into the New Testament. We'll get into what Paul says and other New Testament writers about the resurrection. We'll try to follow somewhat of a chronology. What were the first words about resurrection in the New Testament? Okay, they're not from the Gospels. The Gospels are going to be written after some of the early testimony about the resurrection. But I hope this sort of gives you some things to think about. I hope it increases your understanding. Resurrection is going to be culture shock and surprise, and the language that's going to be used by the first Christian community is going to take the world by storm.